She was a monarch, and one of England's most renowned rulers. Elizabeth I led her country through a golden era of cultural achievement, military victories, and the shaping of an empire. But behind the symbols of power lay a woman whose final days remain one of the most puzzling endings in royal history. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy the content. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see our global community come together. Now lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a calming hum, and let's step quietly into tonight's story. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth I was nearing 70, a remarkable age for Tudor England. Her famously pale complexion, once carefully maintained with makeup, now revealed signs of wear. Her iconic auburn wigs, once bold and youthful, now crowned a body visibly aged by decades of leadership. For 44 years, she had ruled without a king. She had outlasted adversaries, buried those who courted her, and silenced every challenge to her authority. But now that fierce determination seemed to be weakening. Her intellect remained intact, yet those around her noticed subtle changes. Her appetite had faded. She appeared at court less frequently. The brilliant energy that once radiated from Whitehall seemed to be fading. As the year turned, whispers moved quietly through the corridors of Richmond Palace. The Queen, it seemed, was declining. There had been personal loss, devastating loss. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601 had deeply affected her. Though he had rebelled against her and tried to claim power, Elizabeth had cared for him. Some said as a mother figure, others hinted at deeper feelings. Watching him walk to his death broke something within her. She never truly recovered. In her final winter, she stood for hours, refusing food or rest. Servants noted she barely sat down, and when she did speak, her voice was faint, like smoke. Often, she would stare silently into the cold fireplace, as though seeing something no one else could. The court began to make preparations. Doctors offered remedies and prayers, but she rejected them all. Ministers encouraged her to rest, to speak, to name an heir, but the Queen only shook her head. Something weighed on her, heavier than politics, perhaps heavier than the crown itself. By March, those closest to her had begun to accept the truth. Elizabeth I's reign was coming to a quiet, sorrowful end. At Richmond Palace, the atmosphere grew somber. The lively court, once filled with music and conversation, had grown still. The Queen, once admired across Europe for her wit and resolve, now lay in heavy silks, surrounded by silence. She no longer held council meetings or took her regular walks in the gardens. Her ladies-in-waiting, once her closest companions, were gradually sent away. Those few allowed to remain, like Lady Scrope, spoke in soft tones, unsure if their presence brought her peace or discomfort. Some began to whisper that her mind was slipping. Physicians observed something unusual. Not only had she stopped eating, but she also resisted sleep entirely. She stood for hours by her bed or window, as though lying down might hasten death. When her legs failed her, she sat rigidly on cushions, staring at nothing, her lips silently moving in prayer or thought. Some believed she feared death, not as a person, but as a ruler. For over 4 decades, Elizabeth had embodied the spirit of England. Dying meant giving up control of her image, her legacy, her people. That perhaps was her greatest fear. Her health worsened in subtle but clear ways. She developed a constant cough. Her skin grew pale. Her once vibrant frame withered beneath her ornate gowns. She lost weight, yet refused to let anyone examine her closely. Even in illness, her pride endured. But as time passed, the unspoken question lingered. Was this merely age catching up to her? Or was something more serious happening beneath the surface? That question would go unanswered. Her lips, once powerful enough to command empires, now rarely moved at all. To understand the burden Elizabeth carried in her final days, one must consider not only her physical state, but her emotional one, particularly the ghost that lingered. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, their relationship had always been unstable. He was bold, charming, and reckless. He won her favor, defied her authority, then pleaded for forgiveness, only to betray her again. Elizabeth saw both promise and danger in him. She granted him power and status, but his ambition turned destructive. In 1601, he attempted a failed coup. Elizabeth had no choice. Treason could not be tolerated. She signed the order for his execution herself. When he was beheaded in the Tower of London, something inside her broke. From then on, those close to her said she changed, not just in sadness but in guilt. Some claimed she wore a locket with his portrait. Others said she murmured his name at night. Whether true or romanticized, the result was clear. The once untouchable queen now seemed deeply wounded. Grief in that era was poorly understood. What we might now identify as depression was then considered melancholia, a spiritual, not emotional imbalance. But those near her could see the signs. Her eyes dimmed, her laughter faded, her energy drained. Courtiers who had once vied for her attention grew cautious, unsure how far her sorrow might carry her. She stopped writing letters, approving orders, even attending chapel. A shocking absence given her Protestant devotion. Most striking of all, she rejected music. Once a lover of song and poetry, she now asked only for silence. Her heart, it seemed, had broken long before her body followed. By March 1603, Elizabeth's decline could no longer be concealed. What began as grief was now unfolding in front of the court. The Queen, who had bested monarchs and crushed rebellions, now drifted silently through her final days. She barely spoke, communicating with gestures and nods. When asked for guidance on state matters, succession, or her own condition, she turned away. Her advisers were left in uncertainty. Doctors, brought in with increasing urgency, debated her condition. Some thought her humors were unbalanced, a vague diagnosis for physical or mental distress. Others proposed cold distemper of the brain. No one agreed. No one truly knew. Her physical state mirrored her mental one. She refused to lie down, for fear that rest would lead to death. For hours, sometimes days, she remained upright, leaning against cushions, holding onto chair arms, but never reclining. Servants later recalled her standing silently for hours, cloaked in black, unmoving. At night they kept watch, unsure whether she prayed, mourned, or was simply lost in thought. The palace fell into silence. Courtiers whispered, nobles waited outside her chambers. The air grew heavy, not just with fear of losing their queen, but with fear of what would come after. There was no officially named heir. Many expected James VI of Scotland, but without her word, without her seal, would her wishes be honoured. England had seen succession disputes before, and her silence now risked plunging the nation into uncertainty. Among many theories about Elizabeth's death, one stands out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was slow and unseen. It may not have been a weapon or poison that killed her, but her own makeup. For decades, Elizabeth wore her signature white face paint, known as Venetian ceruse. It was a status symbol, used to project purity and nobility, but it contained white lead and vinegar. Yes, lead, a toxic metal, even in small doses. Applied daily, absorbed over time, it could damage the nervous system, weaken muscles, impair thinking, and shorten life. The symptoms of lead poisoning, fatigue, depression, tremors, weight loss, and mental decline matched those Elizabeth showed in her final months. Her teeth had blackened and fallen out. Her once red hair had thinned. Her skin beneath the powder was marred with sores, and yet she continued wearing it. The makeup was not merely vanity, it was protection. a mask she refused to take off, even as it may have poisoned her. Some historians believe that long-term lead exposure significantly contributed to her deterioration. Her grief, her confusion, her sleeplessness, perhaps all made worse by this invisible toxin. But in her time, the danger was unknown. Venetian ceruse was fashionable, even prestigious. It was used by aristocrats across Europe. Ironically, the very image that defined Elizabeth as a ruler may have also accelerated her decline. By mid-March 1603, her condition was unmistakable. Courtiers moved with careful urgency, hiding their alarm. The Queen had stopped eating completely. Her already thin frame appeared hollow, her bones pressed against the rich fabrics of her gowns. She was fading, and still no one could name her illness. Tudor medicine had no real diagnostics, no thermometers, no microscopes, no understanding of infection. Disease was thought to result from imbalanced humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment involved bleeding, herbs, or purging, but nothing helped. Modern scholars now suggest pneumonia may have been the final cause. Cold air in the palace, combined with exhaustion and fasting, may have triggered a deadly lung infection. Her persistent cough, along with weakness and refusal to rest, support this theory, but at the time her decline remained a mystery. And as she slipped further from life, so too faded one of England's most enduring icons, a queen defined not only by power, but by profound and quiet sorrow. The silence around her had become part of the affliction. Her servants moved softly, her ladies wept in private, and her ministers looked on, powerless, as the figure who had shaped their world for decades began to fade, not with drama, but like a candle quietly burning out. No one could intervene. No one could even name the condition. So they waited for an end or a miracle. Though her body was clearly failing, Elizabeth wasn't burdened by illness alone. It was the crushing weight of power. For over 40 years, she had been England itself. Her crown was more than a symbol. It was alive, fed by each decision she made, every word she spoke, every danger she outmaneuvered. Now, in the stillness of her chambers, that crown lay idle, and the looming question of what would come after her hovered like a storm. Elizabeth had no children, no direct heir. The Tudor line, so fiercely defended and celebrated, was about to end with her. Despite her political mastery, she had long avoided naming a successor. Why? Perhaps because doing so meant confronting her own mortality, something she had persistently denied. The most obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman Elizabeth had executed decades before. He was male, Protestant, and descended from Margaret Tudor, Elizabeth's great-grandmother. But his path to the English throne wasn't free of complication. Old rivalries lingered, Catholic claimants remained, loyalties were still divided. As her strength waned, the pressure increased. Her Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, urged her, softly but firmly, to make a formal choice. England couldn't be left adrift. The memory of civil war was not yet distant, and in a time when monarchs ruled by divine right, a queen's death without clear succession was an invitation to disorder. Still, Elizabeth stayed silent. Some claimed she gave a faint nod when asked if James should succeed. Others insisted. She muttered, "I will have no rascal succeed me," only to accept the inevitable later. But there's no clear record, no definitive decision. The Queen, once capable of moving nations with her words, made no final pronouncement. Perhaps for her, naming a successor meant surrender, admitting that her story, her dynasty, and her reign were nearing their end. Maybe that truth was harder to face than death itself. As March wore on and the air turned colder, those around Elizabeth began facing a strange and unsettling reality. The Queen refused to sleep. Not occasionally, but entirely, days blurred into nights as she stood or sat in her chamber, her gaze distant, her spirit seemingly detached. It seemed she wasn't afraid of dying, but of what came just before it. Rest. Her attendants pleaded with her to lie down, but she resisted with such force that they stopped trying. Her defiance wasn't only stubbornness, it carried the weight of superstition and grief. In Tudor belief, sleep was sometimes viewed as a trial run for death, a time when the soul wandered dangerously close to the beyond. Elizabeth, despite her sharp intellect, may have believed that if she closed her eyes, they wouldn't open again. So she remained upright, at times hunched in her chair, at others leaning against the wall. Her legs swelled, her breathing grew shallow, but she would not lie down. Music was offered. She declined. Warm drinks were brought. She refused. She did not want comfort. It was as if she was standing guard at her own passing, unwilling to invite it in. Eventually, her body betrayed her. She collapsed multiple times. On one occasion, she was found crumpled on the floor, having refused to call for help. After that, her ladies-in-waiting stayed near, rotating in quiet shifts, shadows of the court she had once commanded. Even they now spoke only when spoken to. The room grew thick with reverence, grief, and fear. When at last she allowed herself to be placed in bed, it wasn't from calm acceptance, it was pure exhaustion. Her strength was gone. She was laid beneath the covers like a sacred relic being, lowered into silk. For many, this marked the beginning of the end. The chamber changed with her surrender. The silence deepened. The few who were closest gathered, advisors, ladies, physicians, all knowing this was more than the end of a queen. It was the close of an era. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled England for over a century, was ending with her. The room dimmed. Tapestries softened the sound. Candles flickered. Outside, the palace waited in stillness. No proclamations were made, no bells tolled. Only whispers crept through the halls of Richmond Palace. Those who had served her stood motionless, watching. For some word, some final gesture, but it never came. Despite the moment's enormity, Elizabeth said nothing. She, who had once rallied armies, dissolved parliaments, and enchanted foreign courts with her speech, spoke not a single parting word, not to her ladies, not to her counsellors, not to her people. Instead, she communicated with the smallest of gestures, a faint nod, a flicker of her eyes, the trembling of her hand. Some believed she gestured toward the crown nearby. Others saw her hand move toward a portrait of James VI. But no words followed. No final statement would echo through time. What did she see in her silence? Perhaps the memories of her reign. A young girl imprisoned by her sister Mary, the victorious queen at Tilbury, the dazzling court of poets and explorers, the turmoil of religious conflict, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the loss of the Earl of Essex. A life of power shadowed by profound loneliness. Beyond her chamber, preparations were quietly underway. Courtiers packed, ambassadors drafted coded letters, messengers waited with horses, all knew what was coming. Yet still, England was a nation without a sovereign. For as long as Elizabeth drew breath, no one could replace her. As her final hours passed, those in her chamber stood still, solemn, hushed, uncertain. She no longer responded to touch or sound. Her breathing grew shallow. Her skin turned pale, then ashen. The fire that had sustained her dimmed to a faint flicker. Lady Scrope, one of her most loyal companions, refused to leave her side. She held Elizabeth's hand, wiping her brow with rosewater. Others stood quietly, whispering prayers, some aloud, others within. There was no ritual for this, no precedent for a monarch like her. Outside, Richmond Palace lay cloaked in tension. No public announcement had been made. No one dared declare her death before her final breath passed. Messengers stood by, ready to ride to Scotland the moment it was confirmed, to inform James VI, the man who would be king. Time slowed. Minutes stretched endlessly. No one spoke of what came next. Even Robert Cecil, architect of the peaceful transition to the Stuart line, stood still, holding papers in his hand. His greatest act of statecraft was about to unfold, but it all rested on one woman's final moment. Then, just before dawn on March 24th, 1603, it happened. No cry, no gasp, just silence. The room froze for a full minute. Then quietly, Lady Scrope pulled a linen cloth over the Queen's face. It was over. Elizabeth, I was gone. Her death came without ceremony, no fanfare, no priest's last rites. She had declined them all. The Virgin Queen, as she was often called, died alone, not surrounded by kin or heirs, but by the weight of history, born into scandal, ruling through conflict, passing into legend with the quiet resolve she had always carried, dignified, firm, and ultimately unknowable. Her death sent a chill across the kingdom, not because it was a surprise, but because of what it left behind. A throne without a voice, a court without direction, a nation unsure of its future. To many, she was the only monarch they had ever known. Her image had been stamped on coins and consciousness alike. Now that image had gone still. Her body remained untouched, in line with custom. Her ladies kept vigil, murmuring psalms. A single candle burned at her side. The cloth on her face didn't hide her. It preserved her, as though England needed one last look to believe she was truly gone. But while grief filled Richmond Palace, elsewhere the machinery of state moved quickly. Robert Cecil, perhaps the only man who truly grasped the magnitude of this moment, acted swiftly. His secret negotiations with James VI had prepared for this day. Couriers raced through muddy spring roads with news that would reshape Britain. Back in London, the public still hadn't been told. No bells rang, no mourning was declared. The court kept her death quiet, at least for a few hours, fearing unrest or political opportunism. But word eventually spread. First through staff, then to merchants and clergy. The Queen was gone, and with her the Tudor era. She had no child, no sibling raised alongside her, no cousin prepared to take her place. Elizabeth left no personal heir, only a political hope. That her unspoken preference would be respected. The Privy Council met in whispered urgency. The moment was delicate. The nation needed direction. Fast. Fears of infighting, Catholic rebellion or foreign interference haunted them. The violence of past transitions lingered, yet Elizabeth's silence had not left them unprepared. Within hours of her death, the council announced James VI of Scotland would become James I of England. A new dynasty began, but even as the country turned toward the future, it did so in mourning. For the Queen who had defined an age and left, behind a silence no crown could fill. After the succession was settled, attention returned to the Queen's remains. Elizabeth I, who had carefully crafted her public image for decades, could no longer uphold the illusion. In life, she rarely appeared without her regalia. The white lead makeup, extravagant gowns, red wigs. Even in her final days, she darkened her room and limited visitors. Vanity, yes, but also survival. In a court of rivals, appearing weak was dangerous. Now in death, her body told another story. As her ladies prepared her for burial, they saw what had been hidden for years. Her skin showed signs of illness and age, bruises, sores, the pale tone from years of harsh cosmetics. Her hands, once adorned with rings and power, were now thin and frail. What little hair remained had gone wispy and white. There was no denying it. Elizabeth was truly gone. Part 1. The Funeral of Elizabeth. The mask had fallen away, but what remained was no less majestic, only more authentic. On April 28, 1603, over a month after her death, Queen Elizabeth I was finally laid to rest. The delay wasn't due to oversight, but rather to profound respect. England had lost its longest reigning monarch, and her departure warranted a ceremony worthy of her legacy. The funeral procession began at Whitehall, moving slowly toward Westminster Abbey. London's streets were crowded with mourners, nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. Thousands gazed upon the carriage that bore their queen for the last time. Some cried, others stood quietly. No cheering, no music, only the solemn sound of bells and boots on cobblestone. Her coffin, draped in velvet, was carried on a grand hearse drawn by 4 horses. Above it sat an effigy of Elizabeth I dressed in royal regalia, crown, orb, and scepter in hand. With eyes open and an expression of calm, the figure appeared so lifelike that many thought it was her actual body, upright in death. Behind the hearse marched the honour guard, followed by nobles, members of parliament, and foreign dignitaries. Every step echoed the gravity of the moment, not just the passing of a queen, but the mourning of an entire era. At Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was laid to rest beside her half-sister Mary the Sue, a symbolic reunion between 2 queens long divided by religious and political strife. The tomb bears a poignant inscription, partners in throne and grave. Here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection. Historians have not missed the irony. In life they were rivals. In death they lie united. Her funeral marked more than the death of a monarch. It marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With Elizabeth's passing, so too ended the bloodline that had steered England from the Wars of the Roses into a golden age of discovery, cultural achievement, and rising national identity. As the great doors of the Abbey closed behind her, England itself stood changed. The Elizabethan era had ended. What followed would be shaped by new leadership and a different royal lineage. Part 2. The mystery of her death. More than 400 years have passed since Elizabeth I died, yet the cause of her death remains uncertain. Unlike monarchs who fell in battle or succumbed to clear illnesses, her final days were clouded by secrecy and conflicting reports. As a result, historians, doctors, and curious minds continue to debate what truly ended the life of the Virgin Queen. The most widely accepted theory is simply old age. At nearly 70, Elizabeth had lived far beyond the average lifespan of her time. After ruling for over 4 decades and enduring numerous personal losses, her body may have reached its limit. Her refusal to eat, sleep, or accept care likely accelerated her decline. Without modern medicine, even minor ailments could prove deadly. Another plausible cause is pneumonia. The Queen reportedly became chilled shortly before her health declined. The damp, cold conditions of Richmond Palace, coupled with her frailty, could have allowed an infection to set in. Without antibiotics, pneumonia would have been nearly impossible to treat and often fatal. A more speculative theory involves lead poisoning. Elizabeth famously wore Venetian ceruse, a white makeup known to contain toxic lead. Absorbed over decades, the lead could have caused organ failure, mood changes, and cognitive decline. Her symptoms, fatigue, irritability, and mental fog, align with modern understandings of long-term lead exposure. Then there's the possibility of blood poisoning, perhaps from an infected tooth or wound. Dental care at the time was primitive, and Elizabeth reportedly suffered from tooth decay. A small infection might have entered her bloodstream, resulting in sepsis, an invisible killer in an era with no concept of bacteria or sterilization. Finally, some historians consider the emotional toll. The deaths of Robert Devereux and other close companions may have deeply affected her. Her long silences, refusal to lie down, and evident melancholy could signal profound grief. Untreated depression might have contributed to her decline. In truth, Her death may have stemmed from a combination of these factors: age, illness, toxins, and sorrow, woven into a slow descent. The queen who carried an empire may have ultimately been worn down by its weight, yet she left no explanation behind, only myth. Elizabeth the Fair's death marked more than the end of her life. It marked the end of an identity that England had embraced for over 40 years. She ruled without a husband or heir, embedding herself into the soul of a nation. Her passing was quiet, personal, and unresolved, but the impact of her reign resounded through the centuries. Part 3. Her legacy and transition of power. The country she left behind was dramatically different from the one she had inherited in 1558. England had once been torn by religious division, vulnerable to foreign threats, and politically unstable. Through strategic leadership and charisma, Elizabeth reshaped it into a confident, culturally rich, and respected kingdom. But her death revealed how fragile that unity truly was. Much of it had been held together by her presence and personality. With her gone, uncertainty returned. The peaceful accession of James V represented a political success, but also marked a major turning point. The Tudor era had ended. The Stuart era had begun, and with it a new and untested chapter. Still, what lingered in the hearts of her people wasn't merely her policies, but her image. The speeches at Tilbury, her refusal to marry, the self-fashioned persona of the Virgin Queen, the ornate dresses, jeweled accessories, high forehead, and poetic language, all of it became legendary. Even her silence in death enhanced her myth. She exited without a final word, leaving her legacy to speak for itself. In life, she had mastered performance. In death, she allowed stillness to carry her final message. Though scholars may continue to argue over the specifics of her passing, her influence remains beyond dispute. The Elizabethan age is still remembered as one of the most luminous periods in English history. Her name has become synonymous with a time of flourishing literature, global exploration, and rising national pride. Though her body rests quietly beneath Westminster Abbey, her story persists, told in books, celebrated on stage, and etched into the spirit of the monarchy she once ruled. She died alone, but not forgotten. Part 4. The Sacred Origins of Cacao Long. Before chocolate bars filled store shelves or hot cocoa became a winter comfort, cacao was something altogether different. It wasn't sweet and it wasn't eaten, it was drunk. Bitter, foamy, and revered, cacao held deep significance for the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica. To them, it was more than flavor, it was sacred. Our story begins over 3,000 years ago in the tropical rainforests of what is now southern Mexico. The Olmec, one of the earliest advanced societies in the Americas, were likely the first to cultivate the cacao tree. Though much of their history is still unknown, evidence suggests they used cacao in rituals, perhaps as a ceremonial drink for leaders or shamans. It was no ordinary refreshment. It was believed to contain spiritual energy, but it was the Maya who fully embraced cacao as a divine gift. Their civilization flourished across Central America from around 250 to 900 CE. According to Maya mythology, cacao was a sacred plant given by the gods, woven into the very creation of humanity. The Popol Vuh, a sacred Maya text, describes how humans were formed from maize and cacao, binding them to the natural and cosmic worlds. Cacao was consumed during sacred ceremonies, reserved for religious and noble contexts. Priests offered it to the gods, elites drank it at grand feasts. It was thought to energize the soul and connect one with the divine. Typically served cold and mixed with chili, cornmeal or spices, it was poured repeatedly between vessels to create a rich foam, a mark of refinement and ritual quality. Beyond the ceremonial, cacao held economic weight. Maya markets used cacao beans as currency. A handful might buy a tamale, 100 could buy a turkey. They were stored like coins, traded in bulk, and even forged. Some were made from clay to mimic the real thing. For the Maya, cacao wasn't a treat. It was currency, culture, and sacred connection. It was the drink of gods, flowing through the blood of kings and priests. Its bitter taste began a culinary tradition like no other. Across Maya cities such as Tikal and Copan, cacao appeared in life's defining moments. At royal coronations, cacao was poured. At weddings, it was drunk by both bride and groom. In burial rites, cacao vessels accompanied the dead into tombs, offerings meant to nourish the spirit beyond the grave. These drinks weren't sweet nor casual. They were blended with powerful ingredients, chili, maize, vanilla, even blood, crafted to awaken the senses and open the mind. Cacao was believed to bridge the physical and divine, granting insight or visions. The trees themselves were sacred. With their curved limbs and colorful pods, cacao symbolized abundance, life, and fertility. Maya art depicted gods emerging from cacao pods or kings offering the drink to deities. It was present in temples, ceremonies, and social rituals alike. 2. Host a guest was to offer cacao. To make peace was to share it. The drink marked hospitality and respect, a ceremonial bond. Wealthy families used ornate vessels marked with hieroglyphs, identifying the drink's owner and purpose. These cups were more than tools. They were heirlooms, crafted with artistic care. Cacao was not just consumed, it was honored. It connected people to gods, nature, and each other. It was central to Maya identity, a symbol of the sacred in everyday life. Part 5. Cacao and the Aztec Empire. Centuries after the Maya, another empire would elevate cacao to even greater heights: the Aztecs. By the time Hernán Cortés and the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, cacao had become an essential institution in Aztec society. It served as money, medicine, and privilege. The Aztecs couldn't grow cacao in their cooler highland capital, Tenochtitlan, so they sourced it through trade or tribute. Conquered territories in southern regions were required to send cacao beans as payment. These beans were stored in warehouses like currency, treated with the same importance as precious metals. Each bean had value. 10 might buy a small rabbit. 100 could purchase a turkey. Workers were paid in beans. Debts were settled with them. Faking a cacao bean, filling a hollowed shell with dirt, was considered a serious offense. But cacao wasn't just currency. It was power. Known as Xocolatl, it was a drink reserved for warriors, priests, and nobility. Commoners rarely consumed it. Prepared with water, chili, and sometimes maize, it was believed to enhance strength and clarity before battle. Emperor Moctezuma's sect was famously said to drink up to 50 cups a day, convinced it boosted vitality and acted as an aphrodisiac. At first, priests treated the cacao substance with deep reverence. They found it odd, bitter, unsweetened, spicy. Some even described it as unpleasant. But they also noticed something else: the boost in energy, the alertness it sparked, and its strong symbolic presence throughout Aztec society. When the conquest ended and the empire fell, Cortés returned to Spain with more than just gold and silver. He brought cacao beans and the knowledge of how to grind, mix, and drink them. This marked chocolate's first entry into Europe. Initially, it remained a rare luxury of the Spanish court, an exotic gem from the New World. Monasteries prepared it using traditional methods, serving it only to nobility and royalty. But European tastes were different. Over time, chili and maize were replaced by something new: sugar, and sugar changed everything. Adding sweetness to the bitter cacao transformed it entirely. What had been a sacred, spicy drink for warriors became a sweet indulgence, enticing, luxurious, and fashionable. Chocolate was no longer a ritual offering. It became a symbol of wealth and style. Aristocrats sipped it in salons, and royals demanded it at their tables. It was still consumed as a drink, typically hot, but the intense flavor was softened. Ceremonial use gave way to culinary recipes. The spiritual and warrior associations faded. Power now rested with the European elite. But even as chocolate delighted European palates, it began to carry a new bitterness, one rooted not in taste, but in its human cost. To satisfy Europe's growing appetite for cacao and sugar, colonial plantations expanded. A new era of exploitation and slavery emerged. By the 17th century, chocolate had evolved, from a sacred ritual of Mesoamerica to a fashionable delicacy in Europe. Yet behind this sweet transition was a growing darkness. The union of cacao and sugar, though pleasing to the European tongue, helped fuel one of history's harshest systems, the transatlantic slave trade. As Europe's desire for chocolate increased, so did the demand for cacao. The tropical regions of South and Central America and the Caribbean offered ideal climates for cacao cultivation. But harvesting cacao was labor-intensive. The pods had to be hand-picked, split open, and the beans fermented, dried, and roasted. The same held true for sugarcane, another labor-heavy crop. To maximize profits, colonial powers turned to slavery. The Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British all developed plantation systems dependent on enslaved labor. Millions of Africans were captured, transported across the Atlantic, and forced to work under brutal conditions on plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and eventually West Africa. Many spent their lives producing cacao and sugar without ever tasting the sweets made from their labor. The human cost was immense. In the name of chocolate and sugar, families were broken, cultures destroyed, and generations suffered. Meanwhile, in European cities like London, Paris, and Madrid, aristocrats drank hot chocolate, detached from the suffering behind its ingredients. The commodification of cacao marked a shift. It was no longer a sacred gift. It had become a global commodity, something to be traded, taxed, and profited from. As industrialization advanced, demand for chocolate surged. What had started as a ceremonial drink infused with reverence was now intertwined with empire and exploitation. The taste that once symbolized divine connection now left behind a legacy of blood, suffering, and systemic injustice. Yet chocolate's allure only grew stronger. Its association with love, luxury, and pleasure deepened, while its painful origins were gradually hidden beneath layers of sweetness and cream. Chocolate's journey was no longer just about flavor. It became a story of power, profit, and the lives sacrificed along the way. For centuries, chocolate remained a liquid luxury, reserved for royal courts and high society. But with the Industrial Revolution, chocolate would transform again, this time in form, accessibility, and cultural significance. In the early 1800s, inventions and machines reshaped industries, including food. In 1828, Dutch chemist Coenraad Johannes van Houten developed a breakthrough. Using a hydraulic press, he extracted much of the natural fat, cacao butter, from roasted beans. What remained was a solid cake that could be ground into a fine powder. This powder dissolved easily and mixed smoothly with sugar, making chocolate lighter, cheaper, and more practical to produce. This process gave rise to what we now know as Dutch cocoa and laid the groundwork for solid chocolate. In 1847, the British firm Fry and Sons combined cacao powder, cacao butter, and sugar to create the first modern chocolate bar, smooth, moldable, and portable. Chocolate could now be held, not just sipped. Then came the Swiss. In the 1870s, Daniel Peter introduced milk chocolate by adding condensed milk, making it creamier and sweeter. His friend and competitor, Rodolphe Lindt, invented the conching, machine, which churned chocolate slowly to improve its texture, giving it the silky smoothness we now associate with high-quality chocolate. These innovations turned chocolate into a mass-market product. With improved texture and lower costs, it was no longer reserved for the elite. Chocolate entered stores, factories, and school lunchboxes throughout Europe and later the United States. Companies like Cadbury, Nestlé, and Hershey industrialized chocolate on a massive scale. Packaging became colorful and fun, and advertisements focused on joy, indulgence, and childhood magic. But in making chocolate sweet, solid, and widely available, something vital was lost. The sacred drink of the gods became a convenient snack. Its deeper meaning was forgotten. Still, a new chapter had begun, one that would see chocolate become beloved around the world. By the early 20th century, chocolate had become more than a treat. It was an industry. What began as a sacred beverage among ancient cultures was now mass-produced by factories and marketed through global capitalism. In the US, chocolate took a unique path. Milton Hershey, in the late 1800s, brought industrial efficiency to chocolate making, much like Henry Ford would with automobiles. His Pennsylvania factory produced affordable milk chocolate for everyday Americans. By 1900, the Hershey bar was born, and with it, a national obsession. Chocolate became more than a product. It became a cultural symbol. Soldiers carried it into war. Children traded it on playgrounds. It featured in cookbooks, holidays, and romantic traditions. Valentine's Day, Halloween, and Easter all adopted chocolate as a key symbol. Meanwhile, global demand continued to rise. West Africa, particularly Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, surpassed Latin America in cacao production. These were regions once subjected to colonial rule and slavery. Now they supplied over 70% of the world's cacao, often under harsh conditions. Issues like child labor and low wages still plague many farms. Despite these realities, chocolate's popularity soared. In Japan, it became an art form, with delicate bonbons gifted with precision. In Switzerland, chocolate was a national pride, defined by brands like Toblerone and Lindt. In Mexico, it returned to its ancestral roots, used in traditional dishes, like mole, where bitter and savory flavors harmonize. Globally, chocolate became a paradox, widely enjoyed yet deeply personal. Born from ritual, shaped by empire, refined by industry, and now embraced in countless cultural forms. From the Andes to Antwerp, Ghana to Geneva, chocolate became part of humanity's collective story. And though few pause to consider its origins, each bite carries the flavor of history, both sweet and bitter. In the rush of industrialization, chocolate's sacred beginnings faded. What once held spiritual significance became just another snack, tasty, convenient, and mass-produced. But in recent decades, a quiet movement began, a return to chocolate's roots. The craft chocolate movement took shape in the early 2000s, influenced by trends in coffee, wine, and slow food. Artisans and chocolatiers began asking, where does our chocolate come from? Who grows it? What does it taste like before additives? These questions led back to the bean. Unlike industrial chocolate, often made from bulk-blended beans, craft chocolate focused on single-origin cacao. This preserved unique flavors from specific regions and fermentation techniques. Beans from Madagascar might taste citrusy, while Ecuadorian ones could be floral or nutty. Chocolate, it turned out, had terroir, like wine. This shift was about more than flavor. It was also about ethics. As awareness grew, so did concern about how cacao was sourced. Documentaries exposed labor abuses, including child labor and poor wages. In response, many craft chocolate makers partnered directly with farmers, paying fair prices for ethically grown beans. Labels like Fair Trade, Direct Trade, and Rainforest Alliance emerged to build more responsible supply chains. At the same Time, chefs and food historians revived ancient Mesoamerican cacao practices. In parts of Mexico and Guatemala, traditional cacao drinks, made with chili and maize, gained new popularity. Indigenous communities began sharing family recipes, reminding the world that chocolate was born not in factories, but forests, museums, books, and culinary tours followed. People began to see chocolate not just as candy, but as culture, rich in history, heritage, and human experience. Though the world has changed chocolate, its core remains the same. It is still the fruit of a tree, grown by hand, prepared with care and meant to be shared with meaning. For those who take the time to listen, chocolate speaks, not only in sweetness, but in memory. Today, chocolate is everywhere, from vending machines to gourmet kitchens. It symbolizes comfort, luxury, and celebration, but beneath its creamy exterior lies a complex history, one shaped by gods and empires, by joy and exploitation, by rituals and reinventions. Chocolate mirrors civilization itself, from the sacred rites of the Maya to the bitter brews of Aztec warriors, from enslaved workers on colonial plantations to the salons of European nobility, from wartime rations to Valentine's Day candies, chocolate has evolved alongside humanity. Its legacy is complex. On one side, it reflects creativity, resilience, and cross-cultural innovation. It shows how ingredients from one world can blend with techniques from another to create something new. It's inspired science, poetry, and culinary art. On the other side, chocolate's shadow lingers. Much of the industry still relies on farmers in poverty, many of whom have never tasted the chocolate their beans become. Despite growing awareness and ethical certifications, problems like underpayment, deforestation, and child labor persist. Chocolate is also a story of forgotten voices. Indigenous peoples who once held cacao sacred had their traditions erased by colonization. Only recently have their contributions been acknowledged again. Every time we bite into a truffle or sip hot cocoa, we connect, knowingly or not, with that deep and often painful history. Yet, for all its contradictions, chocolate continues to bring people together. It comforts, celebrates, and persists. Perhaps that is chocolate's truest legacy, not just its flavor, but its enduring presence through every chapter of our shared human story. While many Native American tribes adopted agricultural practices similar to those of the United States and converted to Christianity, assimilation never satisfied white settlers or lawmakers. They published bilingual newspapers and even sent delegates to Washington. But it wasn't enough. What settlers ultimately wanted was the land. States like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi began pushing further into native territories, enacting laws that dissolved tribal governments, invalidated native land rights, and pressed the federal government to intervene. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia only escalated tensions. Settlers claimed the land was too valuable to remain in native hands. President Andrew Jackson, a former general and strong supporter of removal, proposed a direct solution: eliminate native presence in the east by relocating tribes west of the Mississippi River. This would clear the way for white settlers and expanding cotton plantations. This wasn't just policy. It was ideology. Although the term hadn't yet been coined, the spirit of manifest destiny fueled American expansion. The belief that white Americans were destined to claim the entire continent. Regardless of who already lived there, this marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, the Trail of Tears. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. While the act was framed as a fair and voluntary exchange, it launched a calculated and systematic effort to uproot Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. The law empowered the president to negotiate treaties that would trade native lands east of the Mississippi for territory in what became known as Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. Supporters claimed it would protect native populations by moving them away from white encroachment. In truth, it was a land grab masked as benevolence. Jackson, praised for his violent campaigns against the Creek and Seminole, viewed removal as a logical next step in U.S. expansion. He claimed native peoples were incapable of living peacefully alongside white Americans and said they lacked the capacity for progress. Removal, he argued, wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. Congress was split. The Senate passed the bill by only a few votes. The House approved it by just 5. These narrow margins were enough to unleash one of the most painful forced migrations in American memory. Some tribes reluctantly agreed to relocate, fearing war or further dispossession. Others resisted, trusting in treaty promises that offered money, supplies, and safe passage. Promises that in reality were often broken. The process was chaotic and brutal. Rather than a peaceful transfer, removal turned into a nightmare of deception, violence, and coercion. Families were driven from their homes. Soldiers burned villages and destroyed crops. Settlers quickly moved in to claim the cleared land. The Indian Removal Act didn't just redraw borders. It shattered communities, severed ancestral ties, and laid bare a bitter truth. American progress was built not only on ambition, but on immense suffering. As pressure mounted for tribes to sign removal treaties, the Cherokee Nation chose a different course. Rather than resorting to violence, they turned to the courts, using U.S. law in defense of their sovereignty. Under Principal Chief John Ross, the Cherokee established a written constitution, formed a central government, and sought recognition as a sovereign nation within U.S. borders. Their strategy was to show that their political system mirrored the American Republic and that they had the right to self-govern. Their legal resistance led to 2 major Supreme Court decisions. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, they sought to block Georgia's laws that stripped their rights and lands. The court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Cherokee were a domestic dependent nation and thus could not sue. A major setback. However, the next year, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, brought a partial victory. The court ruled that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee territory and reaffirmed that only the federal government could negotiate with native nations. For a moment, justice seemed within reach, but President Jackson reportedly dismissed the ruling, allegedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." While it's unclear if he used those exact words, his actions showed his disregard. He refused to enforce the ruling, and Georgia ignored it. Despite holding out, the Cherokee were divided. A minority faction, led by Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, believed removal was unavoidable. In 1835, they signed the Treaty of New Echota without the consent of the Cherokee government. Though widely opposed by the Cherokee people, the U.S. Senate narrowly ratified the treaty, effectively ending the Cherokee legal struggle and making forced removal official. In the spring of 1838, under orders from President Martin Van Buren, thousands of federal troops and state militias arrived to carry out the removal. With little warning, Cherokee families were evicted from their homes. Soldiers arrived at their doors with bayonets, giving them just minutes to gather their belongings, often only what they could carry. Homes were ransacked and burned, fields left to rot, and entire communities dismantled. Over 16,000 Cherokee were herded into makeshift military camps, where they faced overcrowding, disease, and poor sanitation. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough spread rapidly, claiming many lives before the march even began. Some groups were forced to leave immediately. Others waited through the sweltering summer, only to be marched in fall through freezing rain and snow with insufficient clothing or food. The Cherokee called the path Nunadal-Tsuni, the trail where they cried. The journey spanned roughly 200 miles, through mud, ice, rivers, and mountains. Elders collapsed from exhaustion. Children died in their parents' arms. Many were buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Families tried to preserve dignity, singing, praying, recording names, but the grief was overwhelming. Cold pierced thin clothes, and soldiers showed little compassion. By early 1839, when the final group reached Oklahoma, more than 4,000 Cherokee, nearly a quarter of their population, had perished. This wasn't just a relocation, it was a death march, a forced erasure of land, identity, and community. But the suffering didn't end there. The Cherokee arrived weakened and traumatized. They had lost elders who carried tradition, children who held the future, and leaders who had fought for justice. There were no funerals, no time to mourn. The promised fertile land and supplies were unreliable or never delivered. The environment was harsh and unfamiliar. Emotional wounds ran deep. The Cherokee had placed their faith in the legal system only to be betrayed. Their sovereignty was denied. Among survivors, internal strife grew. Those who had signed the Treaty of New Echota were labeled traitors. In June 1839, just months after the relocation, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were assassinated in a wave of retaliation. The nation, already shattered by removal, was further divided by civil conflict. Yet the Cherokee persevered. They rebuilt schools, restored their government, restarted newspapers, and preserved their language and stories. The resilience that once carried them through the courts now sustained them through recovery, but the scars of removal remained, and still do. The Trail of Tears is not just a historical event, it's a living memory passed through families and traditions, a source of deep sorrow, but also enduring strength. While the Cherokee Trail of Tears is the most recognized, it was not unique. The Indian Removal Act affected multiple nations, each with its own culture, language, and land. Each experienced its own trail of loss. The Choctaw were the first to be removed in 1831. Thousands were marched out of Mississippi and Alabama, often on foot and without adequate supplies. Many died crossing icy rivers and enduring freezing rains. One Choctaw leader later called it a trail of tears and death. The Creek, once dominant in the southeast, were next. After years of broken agreements and violence, over 15,000 Creek were removed in 1836. Many were shackled, thousands died, and some were enslaved or scattered from their families. The Chickasaw negotiated for payment before removal, but delays in compensation left them stranded without resources. Hundreds died from disease and hunger during the journey. The Seminole in Florida resisted most fiercely. From 1835 to 1842, they engaged in guerrilla warfare in swamps and forests. Leaders like Osceola became symbols of defiance, yet in the end, thousands were captured or killed, and many were forcibly removed. A small group escaped deep into the Everglades, where their descendants remain. In total, over 100,000 Native Americans were displaced under the removal policy. The U.S. government called it necessary. Settlers called it progress. But for Native nations, it was disaster. Each nation's story is unique, but all share common themes: betrayal, loss, and resilience. Sacred lands were taken, cultural centers dismantled, families and communities scattered. Still, these nations carried with them their songs, languages, and spirit into a land that did not welcome them, yet where they would find ways to survive. When the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole finally reached Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, they found not peace, but the beginning of a new struggle. As U.S. states pushed westward, new pressures began to mount. Railroads sliced through tribal lands, and treaties, once promised as sacred, were revised or outright ignored, often under coercion or political manipulation. Lands that had been set aside as sovereign territories continued to shrink, yet in the face of these trials, native nations persevered. The Cherokee rebuilt their capital in Tahlequah and re-established schools and institutions. The Choctaw and Chickasaw restructured their governments, adopted new constitutions, convened councils, and built churches. Farming resumed. Communities began to recover, not by forgetting, but through resilience. Still, even within Indian territory, the threat of further removal persisted. Every promise meant to safeguard their new homeland was vulnerable to the same forces that had displaced them before: greed, expansionism, and disregard. What was supposed to be a permanent home became a temporary refuge in a country still unwilling to fully accept native people as rightful, enduring inhabitants. While many hoped for peace, history soon revealed otherwise. The Trail of Tears did not end with relocation. It merely marked the beginning of another chapter in the ongoing struggle for survival, sovereignty, and recognition. For many years after the forced removals, the Trail of Tears was seldom discussed. It survived mostly in private, spoken in whispers, passed down through family stories, and rarely acknowledged in schools or political discourse. It remained an open wound, a quiet grief carried by native communities, largely ignored by the nation that inflicted it. But the memory endured. In Cherokee households, elders recounted the long walk west, the freezing temperatures, hunger, and immense loss. Songs were sung in mourning. Ceremonies were held to honor the departed. Oral traditions kept alive the names of those who walked and those who were lost. The land, too, held its memory through old trails, shallow graves, and surviving records that scarred the continent like a wound. It was not just a path of grief, it was a testament to survival. The resilience of native nations after removal defied the expectations of those who sought to erase them. In the decades that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole not only rebuilt, but flourished. They established functioning governments, reopened schools, published newspapers, and preserved their languages and spiritual customs. Against all odds, they endured. Still, the silence from the broader American society remained. Not until the late 20th century did the United States begin to reckon, if only faintly, with the full tragedy of the Trail of Tears. Activists and tribal leaders fought to reintroduce the story into national consciousness. Memorials were built, commemorative trails were designated, and school curriculums gradually updated. The phrase Trail of Tears became a recognized part of American history, known not just by scholars, but by the general public. However, recognition is not the same as justice. The effects of removal continue to reverberate. Disconnection from ancestral lands, intergenerational trauma, and a legacy of broken treaties still shape native life today. Yet through every challenge, these communities continue to draw strength from their history, the same spirit that carried them through forests, across rivers, and into exile lives on today, in language revitalization, cultural preservation, and the stories passed down in families. The Trail of Tears is not only a tale of what was lost, it's a story of what was preserved: memory, hope, and the will to survive. Today, it is remembered as more than a historic event. It is a living legacy. It stands as a reminder of injustice, resilience, and the inner strength required to keep moving forward when the world turns away. The path that once echoed with footsteps of sorrow has become a sacred route of remembrance. Across the U.S., monuments, museums, and designated trails mark the journey. The Trail of Tears, National Historic Trail, created by Congress in 1987, spans over 5,000 miles and 9 states, tracing the forced westward migration. It winds through forests, plains, and quiet towns, inviting those who walk it to briefly imagine the weight of that journey. But genuine remembrance requires more than monuments. For the descendants of those who were displaced, memory lives on in cultural practices, through community events, storytelling gatherings, and annual memorial rides. Language programs help revive what was nearly lost. A story once pushed to the margins has been reclaimed and now resonates with pride. Today, schools teach it. Films portray it. Writers and poets give voice to both the pain and perseverance of that time. Native youth grow up knowing their heritage is not only rooted in endurance, but in dignity, resistance, and cultural continuity. And yet, the work continues. The Trail of Tears poses a fundamental question about how we tell history and how we choose to remember. It urges us to confront the costs of expansion, the cruelty of past policies, and the present-day challenges still faced by native communities. It shows us that progress without compassion is not progress. It is erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears means more than looking back. It means listening closely, learning thoughtfully, and uplifting the voices that history once silenced. It is to understand that the American story is incomplete without its native nations, not only in the past, but in the present and future as well. So we remember not only with sorrow, but with profound respect. For even when betrayed and displaced, the people moved forward. They did not disappear. They endured. The Salem Witch Trials section paraphrased below. In the bitter cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a community under strain. Nestled in the harsh New England frontier, it was more than just a scattering of farms and churches. It was a town on the verge of religious and social breakdown. The Puritans believed they had been chosen by God to build a virtuous life in a dangerous, untamed land. But beneath their outward faith ran deep currents of fear, discord, and suspicion. Life in Salem was governed by strict religious codes. The Puritans believed in an unseen world filled with spiritual forces. To them, the devil was no symbol. He was a real, active presence. Witches, they believed, could sign his book and cast harmful spells. Doubting this worldview was akin to doubting God himself. To question a minister was to question Scripture, and in Salem, spiritual pressure was constant. Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister, embodied this pressure. Stern, distrustful, and prone to paranoia, he filled his sermons with warnings of eternal damnation and satanic plots. His harsh leadership divided the community, creating tension among neighbors and within families. Outside the church, Salem faced other challenges. A long-standing dispute between Salem Village and the wealthier Salem town created economic friction. Land ownership was a source of conflict, and lines between personal grievance, property rights, and religious belief often blurred. The memory of violent Native American attacks during King Philip's War lingered. Crops had failed, and a smallpox outbreak had swept through. In the Puritan mindset, such hardships weren't random. They were signs of divine punishment for hidden sins. In this atmosphere of fear and religious fervor, a group of young girls began to behave in disturbing ways. What might have been dismissed elsewhere as childhood mischief was taken seriously in Salem, where people believed the devil walked among them. It started with two children in January 1692, 9-year-old Betty Parris and her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams. They screamed, thrashed, barked, and spoke incoherently. They claimed to feel invisible pinches and pricks. Reverend Parris was alarmed. Dr. William Griggs examined the girls and delivered a chilling diagnosis. They were under an evil hand. In Salem's deeply religious community, that could only mean one thing: witchcraft. Soon, other girls began to exhibit similar symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard joined the ranks of the afflicted. These girls came from respected families, which gave their words influence. When asked who was tormenting them, they pointed fingers. The first accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean descent in the Paris household. Her background and unfamiliar traditions made her an easy target. Alongside her, the girls named two other women, Sarah Good, a destitute beggar, and Sarah Osborne, who had drawn suspicion for skipping church and marrying her servant. These three women, outsiders in different ways, became the town's first suspects. They were arrested and imprisoned. To the villagers, this was a crisis of faith. If witches lived among them, they had to be exposed and punished. What began as an unexplained illness now spiraled into collective panic. And as fear spread, no one, neighbors, friends, even family, was beyond suspicion. By spring, the courts of Salem began accepting a new kind of testimony, spectral evidence. This referred to claims that an accused witch's spirit was harming victims while their physical body stood elsewhere. The afflicted would cry out in court, saying the spectre of the accused was pinching or choking them. To the Puritan court, these visions were not imagination. They were treated as valid proof of guilt. Denials were dismissed as lies. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Those who confessed and named others were often spared, creating a cycle of fear and accusation. Tituba confessed under pressure. She claimed a man from Boston, clearly meant to represent the devil, promised her freedom if she served him. Her tale of flying spirits and a witch's book filled with signatures terrified the court. Whether she confessed to survive or was manipulated remains unclear, but her testimony fed the hysteria. Other confessions followed, some coerced, others desperate for leniency. Those who maintained their innocence often faced worse treatment. In the dimly lit courtrooms, hysteria overwhelmed logic. Ministers warned against rash judgments, but were often ignored. Jails filled with the accused. Midwives, farmers, even children. Salem's legal foundation crumbled. A town once ruled by scripture was now ruled by fear. By spring 1692, the crisis had grown too large. Salem's jails overflowed with more than 100 prisoners. In response, Massachusetts Governor William Phips created a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine, to manage the growing chaos. Others were often spared, but those who maintained their innocence faced the gallows. Fear drove every decision. Families turned against one another. Neighbors testified in self-preservation, and ministers who called for moderation were ignored, overpowered by the public's desperate demand for purification. Above the town, a gallows stood on proctors, ledge quietly waiting as Salem, trial by trial, fed it names. By the peak of summer 1692, Salem had transformed, not into a village or town, but into a crucible of fear, accusations, and fervent moral outrage. The witch trials spread beyond Salem village and Salem town, igniting hysteria in surrounding areas like Ipswich, Andover, and Gloucester. Accusations surged, jails were packed, and no one felt secure. The accused came from every background. Some were marginalized outsiders, beggars, former slaves, and widowed women. Others were prominent, church deacons, wealthy landowners, even former accusers. Once suspicion took hold, it spared no one. Families imploded, spouses turned on each other, children testified against parents, friends became informants. Even those who doubted the legitimacy of the trials found themselves accused. Questioning the existence of witches was viewed by some as aligning with them. Nowhere was this hysteria more vividly on display than in the courtroom. The afflicted girls played a central role, screaming in pain, claiming to see invisible animals, mimicking the accused, or collapsing en masse. However implausible their actions, the court accepted their behavior as evidence, interpreting their suffering as divine validation. By late summer, over 150 people had been arrested, and executions continued. Sarah Good, a homeless woman, was hanged in July for refusing to confess. Her denial was not seen as integrity, but as defiance against God. Rebecca Nurse, a devout grandmother and member of the Salem Church, was also executed despite community protest. Her death sent a chilling message: piety offered no protection. Still, the accusations escalated. Children as young as 5 were imprisoned. A minister's wife was accused. Entire families were locked in cells. The colony had abandoned reason, consumed by the very evil it believed it was purging. Fear now ruled Salem, warping justice, distorting memory, and silencing any dissent. What began as strange afflictions had morphed into something far more sinister. A community unraveling under the weight of its own paranoia. As autumn neared, the Salem witch trials reached their bleakest point. The gallows at Proctor's Ledge had become a symbol of final judgment, its silence absorbing the cries for mercy. These executions were public events, intended as warnings. Crowds gathered. Some watched solemnly, others disturbingly treated them as entertainment. One by one, the condemned were led to the scaffold, hands bound, whispering prayers until the trapdoors gave way. Lives ended in the name of righteousness. In total, 19 people were hanged, 14 women and 5 men. All asserted their innocence. Many died praying, their final words trembling but devout. None were given proper burials. As convicted witches, church cemeteries refused them. Some were buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Others were secretly retrieved by family under cover of darkness. But the most harrowing death was not on the gallows. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer and husband of the accused Martha Corey, refused to enter a plea, hoping to protect his estate from seizure. In response, the court sentenced him to pressing, a rare and brutal punishment. Corey was stripped, laid flat, and crushed beneath heavy stones for 2 days. He remained silent, his legendary final words, "More weight." He died having never entered a plea, becoming a symbol of resistance against the trial's injustice. Those left in jail endured horrific conditions. Pregnant women gave birth in filth. The ill died from neglect. Families paid for their food and shackles. Some remained imprisoned even after the trials ended. By autumn, Salem had condemned more people to death for witchcraft than any other American community in history. What began as whispers had turned to blood. And while the executions would soon stop, the damage was irreversible. By late September 1692, the hysteria finally began to wane, not because of court intervention, but due to growing discomfort and delayed realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Doubt crept in as respected figures like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor were executed. If the devout and principled could be witches, then who could be trusted? When accusations reached Martha Corey and Lady Mary Phipps, wife of the colony's former governor, the upper class felt the threat. The trials no longer targeted only the powerless. Now, no one was beyond reach. Reverend Increase Mather, a leading Puritan minister and father of Cotton Mather, publicly denounced the use of spectral evidence, the basis for many convictions. He stated, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned." It was a striking reversal, an implicit rebuke of the court's entire process. Others followed. Ministers once supportive of the trials called for restraint. Families of the accused spoke out. Neighboring towns, horrified, began distancing themselves. Faced with growing outrage and political pressure, Governor William Phipps took action. In October, he disbanded the court of Oya and Termina and replaced it with a new tribunal that no longer permitted spectral evidence. The impact was swift. Most of the remaining accused were acquitted. Those convicted were granted reprieves. The executions ended, but the damage had already been done. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, more than 100 imprisoned, and countless others traumatized. Though the judicial process had shifted, it would take months to release all prisoners, and years more for Salem to begin reckoning with what had happened. In that autumn, fear finally loosened its grip. The gallows stood silent. The cries of the accusers faded. Salem, scarred and ashamed, had to face a bitter truth. It had not been witches that ruled it, but fear itself. When the last prisoners were freed in 1693, Salem was left with more than empty cells. It was left with guilt. The trials had ended, but betrayal and sorrow still haunted homes and churches. A heavy silence settled over the town. In the years that followed, remorse emerged. One of the most significant apologies came in 1697 from Judge Samuel Sewall. During a day of fasting and prayer at Boston South Church, he stood before the congregation, publicly accepting responsibility and asking God's forgiveness. His rare act of contrition set a precedent. Others, however, did not apologize. Some judges and accusers remained silent or defended their roles, claiming they acted with sincerity. Yet among many clergy, there was consensus that the court had failed gravely. Even Cotton Mather, once a supporter of spectral evidence, softened his stance in later writings. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the original child accusers, offered a formal apology to her church. She confessed that her false claims led to the deaths of innocent people, admitting she had been misled by Satan. Her words were among the few that directly named the victims and acknowledged their suffering. Families of the accused spent decades seeking to clear their loved ones' names. In 1711, Massachusetts passed a bill restoring the civil rights of many and awarding compensation to their heirs. Still, not all names were cleared, and not all families were reimbursed. The wounds endured for generations. Over time, Salem began to heal, but as a cautionary tale. No longer a symbol of justice, it became a lesson in the dangers of fear-driven governance, biased courts, and mass hysteria. Reckoning had begun, but full justice, as history often shows, remained elusive. More than 300 years have passed since. The gallows loomed over Salem, yet the legacy of the witch trials remains etched into American consciousness, not as a tale of sorcery, but as a warning, a reminder of how fear can overpower truth, and how fragile justice becomes when driven by emotion over evidence. Today, the term Salem witch trials is synonymous with hysteria, false accusations, and moral panic. It's invoked in courtrooms, classrooms, and political debates as a stark reminder of what happens when reason is abandoned. Modern Salem acknowledges its history with nuance. Museums, memorials, and tours draw visitors from around the world. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, established in 1992 on the trial's 300th anniversary, features 20 granite benches, engraved only with names, dates, and final words. No crimes are listed because there were none. These are tributes to dignity in the face of injustice. Yet Salem's story goes beyond tourism or folklore. It speaks to the human condition, how fear spreads, how power can be misused under the guise of morality, and how justice falters when emotion outweighs evidence. Arthur Miller's The Crucible revived the trials for a new generation, casting them as an allegory for the McCarthyism of the 1950s. Miller's work reminded audiences that witch hunts aren't always about witches, and that the past is never as distant as it seems. Descendants of both the accused and the accusers still live in Massachusetts and across the U.S. Some carry ancestral guilt. Others hold pride in survival. In 2001, more than 300 years after the last hangings, the state of Massachusetts officially exonerated the final 5 victims, completing the legal clearing of all those condemned. The Salem witch trials lasted just over a year, but their lessons are timeless. They teach us that truth must be upheld, even when fear dominates the conversation, and that the gravest injustices often unfold not in darkness, but in full daylight.